Australia, a land of boundless plains, world-class cities, and endless beaches. Yet amidst this utopia lurks a troubling reality. The dream of homeownership is slipping away for many. In a nation celebrated for its high quality of life, owning a home has long been a cornerstone of the Australian identity. It's not just about having a roof over your head, it's a symbol of stability, success, and belonging. But in recent years, this dream has turned into a nightmare. Skyrocketing prices, stagnant wages, and a perfect storm of economic factors have pushed homeownership out of reach for a growing number of Australians. The Great Australian Dream is becoming the Great Australian Disappointment. It's a paradox. Australia is a vast country with a relatively small population. There should be plenty of room for everyone. Yet in our cities, where most jobs are concentrated, housing has become a scarce and overpriced commodity. Families are squeezed into tiny apartments. Young people resign themselves to a lifetime of renting. Even those who manage to buy often find themselves saddled with crippling mortgage debt. This isn't just a matter of individual struggle. The housing crisis is shaping our society in profound ways. It's widening the gap between rich and poor, creating a generation of renters, and changing the very fabric of our communities. As homeownership becomes a privilege of the wealthy, what does that mean for the egalitarian spirit Australia prides itself on? The Great Australian Dream, a phrase that evokes images of a quarter-acre block, a backyard for the kids to play in, and a sense of security and belonging. It's a dream that has been deeply ingrained in the Australian psyche for generations. But how did this dream come to be, and what has happened to it over the years? In the 1950s post-World War II boom, Australia was experiencing unprecedented prosperity. The economy was thriving, jobs were plentiful, and the government actively encouraged homeownership through policies like the War Service Home Scheme. For many Australians, owning a home became not just an aspiration but an expectation. It was seen as a fundamental right, a key part of the social contract. Fast forward to the 1970s, and the dream was still very much alive. Housing prices were relatively low compared to incomes, and it was common for young couples to buy their first home in their early 20s. In 1970, the median house price in Sydney was around $18,700, roughly 4 times the average annual wage. Compare that to today, where the median house price in Sydney is over $1 million, more than 10 times the average annual wage. So what happened? How did we go from a nation where homeownership was within reach for most to one where it's becoming increasingly out of reach? There are a number of factors at play. Firstly, Australia's population has grown significantly over the past few decades, particularly in our major cities. We're one of the most urbanized countries in the world, with around 90% of our population living in urban areas. This has put immense pressure on our city's housing markets. Supply simply hasn't kept up with demand, leading to skyrocketing prices. Immigration has also played a role. Australia has one of the highest per capita immigration rates in the world, with over 28% of our population born overseas. While immigration has brought many benefits to our country, it has also contributed to the demand for housing, particularly in our major cities where most immigrants settle. Another factor is the changing nature of our economy. In the past, manufacturing and other industries provided stable, well-paying jobs that allowed workers to save for a home. But as our economy has shifted towards services and knowledge-based industries, job security has decreased and wages have stagnated for many. At the same time, the cost of living has continued to rise, making it harder for people to save for a deposit. Government policies have also had an impact. In recent decades, successive governments have introduced measures like negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts, which have made housing an attractive investment for those who can afford it. This has led to a surge in investment properties, with investors competing with first homebuyers and driving up prices. All of these factors have combined to create a perfect storm, a housing market that is increasingly unaffordable for many Australians. According to a recent report by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, the proportion of households in housing stress that is spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs has risen from 15% in the early 1990s to 20% today. For low-income households, the situation is even worse, with over 50% in housing stress. As we've seen, the Great Australian Dream has been under threat for some time now, but what exactly has caused this crisis? It's not just one factor, but a perfect storm of interrelated issues that have converged to create the situation we find ourselves in today. At the heart of the problem is a fundamental imbalance between supply and demand, particularly in our major cities. Australia's population has been growing rapidly, fueled by both natural increase and immigration. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, our population grew by 1.5% in 2019, which equates to an additional 371,000 people. The majority of this growth has been concentrated in our major cities, with Sydney and Melbourne alone accounting for over half of Australia's total population growth. This rapid growth has put immense pressure on our cities' housing markets. Despite the increasing demand, the supply of new housing has struggled to keep pace. A 2018 report by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute found that between 2006 and 2016, the number of households in Australia grew by 19%, but the housing stock only grew by 13%. This mismatch between supply and demand has been a key driver of rising prices. But why hasn't supply kept up? Part of the problem lies in our urban planning. Australian cities have traditionally been characterized by low-density suburban sprawl. As our cities have grown, they've tended to expand outwards rather than upwards. This pattern of development has several downsides. It leads to longer commutes, increased infrastructure costs, and a loss of agricultural land and natural habitats. More importantly, for the housing crisis, it's an inefficient use of land. Low-density development means fewer homes can be built on a given piece of land, which limits supply. It also pushes new development to the city fringes, far from jobs and amenities, which can make these areas less attractive to buyers and renters. In recent years, there has been a shift towards higher density development in some areas, particularly around transport hubs. But this has often been met with resistance from local communities who fear that increased density will lead to overcrowding and a loss of neighborhood character. This "not in my backyard" NIMBY attitude has made it politically difficult to push through the kind of planning reforms needed to significantly boost housing supply. Economic factors have also played a role. Australia's economy has been heavily reliant on population growth to drive economic growth. In this context, high immigration levels have been seen as an economic necessity, but this growth model has its limitations. It relies on a constant influx of new people to sustain demand, which puts ongoing pressure on housing and infrastructure. It also doesn't necessarily improve living standards for existing residents. If economic growth is primarily driven by population increase rather than productivity improvements, per capita incomes may stagnate even as the overall economy grows. These factors have combined to create a particularly acute crisis in Sydney, which has become the second most unaffordable city in the world after Hong Kong. The median house price in Sydney is now over $1 million, more than 10 times the median annual household income. For many Sydneysiders, especially young people and low-income earners, the dream of owning a home has become an impossibility. The consequences of this are already being felt. Sydney is seeing an exodus of young people and key workers like teachers and nurses who are being priced out of the city. This has implications for the city's social fabric and its ability to function effectively. So what can be done? There's no easy answer, but it's clear that business as usual is not an option. We need a multifaceted approach that addresses both supply and demand issues. This might include reforms to planning laws to encourage higher density development in appropriate areas, investment in public and affordable housing, and a rethink of our economic growth model. It also requires a shift in mindset. We need to start seeing housing as a fundamental human right, not just a commodity or an investment vehicle. We need to value the social and economic benefits of stable, affordable housing and be willing to make the tough decisions required to achieve it. The great Australian dream may be under threat, but it's not dead yet. With the right policies and the political will to implement them, we can work towards a future where everyone has access to a safe, secure, and affordable home. It won't be easy, but it's a dream worth fighting for. The housing crisis isn't just about individual struggles to put a roof over one's head. It has far-reaching economic and societal implications that affect us all. Australia now has one of the highest levels of household debt in the world, largely due to ballooning mortgage sizes. This makes our economy vulnerable to shocks. If interest rates were to rise significantly, or if there was a downturn in the housing market, many households could find themselves in financial stress with ripple effects throughout the economy. The crisis is also creating a generational divide. Many young Australians are facing the prospect of being lifelong renters, unable to break into the housing market. This is changing perceptions of success and the traditional life milestones we've long associated with adulthood. Australia isn't alone in facing these challenges. Many other developed nations, from Canada to the UK, are grappling with similar housing affordability issues, but that doesn't make our situation any less urgent. Whichever path we choose, one thing is clear: the status quo is unsustainable. We need to act now to ensure that the great Australian dream doesn't become a relic of the past. The great Australian dream, once a beacon of hope and a symbol of our egalitarian spirit, is now at a crossroads. As housing prices continue to soar and the gap between the haves and have-nots widens, we're forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about our society and our values. Do we want to be a nation where homeownership is a privilege reserved for the wealthy few? Where the security and stability that comes with having a place to call your own is out of reach for most? Or do we want to find a way to make the dream accessible again, to create a more equitable and inclusive society? These are not easy questions, and there are no easy answers. Balancing the competing demands of economic growth, cultural preservation, and housing affordability will require tough choices and innovative thinking. But the cost of inaction is too high. If we don't act now, we risk not only the dream of homeownership, but the very fabric of our society. It's time for a national conversation about housing in Australia. It's time to put all options on the table, to challenge old assumptions and explore new ideas. Most of all, it's time for bold leadership and a willingness to make the hard decisions needed to ensure a fair and prosperous future for all Australians. The great Australian dream may be fading, but it's not gone yet. With courage, compassion, and a commitment to our shared values, we can reimagine it for a new era. We can build a future where everyone has a place to call home and where the promise of Australia is open to all. The dream is worth fighting for, and the fight starts now.